The air was thick with fear and the stench of death. London, the bustling heart of the kingdom, lay under the shadow of the plague. Streets that once buzzed with life were now eerily quiet, the only sounds the muffled coughs of the sick and the clanging of church bells tolling for the dead. It was in this grim atmosphere that King Charles I ascended to the throne, following the death of his father, King James I. Charles, a man of few words and a stammer that often betrayed his shyness, had inherited a kingdom in turmoil. His father's death had left a void, and the people were uneasy. The official tone was one of reassurance, but beneath the surface, changes were afoot. Charles, more determined than anyone had expected, was making his mark. One of the first signs of his resolve came when he dismissed a prominent Spanish supporter from his court. The minister, amazed by the king's steely demeanor, was told to conform to the new regime's anti-Spanish stance or lose his position. Charles was not one to mince words. He made it clear that his court would be different from his father's. Gone were the days of backstairs intrigue and bribery. Now all business must be conducted in public, with a strict timetable governing the king's day, from early morning prayers to evening meals. George Villiers, now the first gentleman of the royal bedchamber, was a key figure in Charles's inner circle. He received the golden key, a symbol of his authority, and was granted access to the king's private chambers at any hour. The court, once a place of debauchery and informality, became more disciplined. Sports and hunting, beloved by James, were sidelined. The king commanded that the royal parks be returned to their previous uses, and the lavish banquets of old were replaced with a more austere atmosphere. But the changes at court were overshadowed by the plague. Bills of mortality posted on church doors listed the growing number of deaths. The sickness had spread to all areas of London, even reaching the king's palace at Greenwich. Plans for Charles's first parliament, crucial for raising funds for military support, were delayed. The city was in disarray, and the king's marriage to the French princess, Henrietta Maria, was also disrupted. Henrietta's journey across the Channel was rough, and she arrived at Dover Castle late at night, exhausted and seasick. The castle, a cold and damp medieval fortress, offered her a bed that was hardly fit for a queen. Charles, who had not been there to greet her, arrived the next morning. When Henrietta met him, she fell to her knees and pledged her service. Charles, bashful and stammering, lifted her up and embraced her warmly, but his eyes lingered on her shoes. Henrietta, mistaking his interest, lifted her skirts to show she was wearing no heels, a gesture that endeared her to the king. Despite the initial warmth, tensions soon arose. Henrietta's retinue, including several Catholic bishops, made the Protestant court uneasy. When a French attendant tried to join the queen in the carriage, Charles, sensitive about who was allowed near him, ordered her out. The queen, indignant, insisted she stay. The French ambassadors intervened, and Charles reluctantly relented, but the incident set the tone for a rocky start to their marriage. The royal couple's journey to London was marred by the plague and relentless rain. Crowds, thinned by the disease, lined the shores as the royal flotilla sailed up the Thames. Charles, undeterred by the risks, appeared before both houses of Parliament, dressed in full regalia, a bold move that some saw as a power play. He delivered a short but pointed speech, urging Parliament to support his plans for war against Spain and the recovery of the Palatinate. The mood in Parliament was hostile. MPs, disgruntled by the king summoning them to a plague-ridden capital, were skeptical of the French marriage and suspicious of secret Catholic concessions. The king's plea for more funds fell on deaf ears, and Parliament voted to adjourn, much to Charles's frustration. In the interlude, George worked tirelessly to prepare for a naval strike against Spain. The plan was ambitious. A fleet would blockade the Spanish port of Cádiz and attack the treasure fleet from the Americas. The pressure to send the fleet was mounting, but lack of funds and supplies threatened to derail the mission. George, eager to prove himself, appointed Sir Edward Cecil as the fleet's commander. Meanwhile, the king's relationship with the queen was strained. Henrietta, stubborn and indomitable, refused to conform to court expectations. Her refusal to ride with Charles without her retinue of ladies led to petty conflicts, and the king struggled to handle her. The tension between them loomed over the court, a dark cloud in an already troubled time. As the fleet prepared to set sail, the kingdom held its breath. The future was uncertain, and the road ahead was fraught with danger. But for Charles and his advisers, the stakes were high, and the time for action was now. The winter of 1625 was bitter and filled with despair. Sir John Eliot, the Vice Admiral of Devon, stood on the cliffs overlooking Plymouth Sound, his heart heavy as he watched the ghostly hulks of the returning fleet. These were the ships that had set sail a few weeks earlier, bound for Cádiz with the promise of a grand victory. But now they drifted back into port, their decks littered with the bodies of the fallen. The first ship appeared on the horizon on December 9th. As it drew closer, Eliot could see the sailors tipping bodies over the gunwales. One by one, more ships followed, each a grim reminder of the disaster that had unfolded. 100 or so ragged, diseased soldiers stumbled into town, their uniforms tattered and their faces gaunt. The mayor, moved by their plight, had to use his own money to buy them clothing, accommodation, and firewood, knowing that without it, they would have perished. Eliot wrote to the king's secretary, trying to piece together the fragmented accounts he was hearing. Captain Balls, who had since died, spoke of the terrible conditions on board. The provisions were scarce and spoiled, leading to a high mortality rate among the troops. Yesterday, 7 fell down in the streets, Eliot wrote. The rest are weak, and unless there is a quick supply of clothes, there is little hope of saving them. By Christmas, 31 ships had limped back to Plymouth, out of the 90 that had set sail. The rest were either lost at sea or forced to seek shelter in distant ports, some as far away as Ireland. The mission, which had been poorly planned and badly executed, had ended in a humiliating retreat from Cádiz. The troops had never even engaged in serious combat with the enemy. Instead, they had been undone by storms, disease, and a series of tactical blunders that culminated in a chaotic and drunken withdrawal, after looting wine from a captured town. Back in London, the news of the disaster only added to the already tense atmosphere at court. King Charles was struggling to maintain his authority, and the failure of the Cádiz expedition was a severe blow to his reputation. Meanwhile, his wife, Henrietta Maria, remained isolated and unhappy, her relationship with the king strained by the presence of her French entourage and the growing influence of George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham. The royal court had been on the move, trying to avoid the plague that was spreading across the country. The disease was rampant, and even the magistrates had given up trying to control it. People were doing as they pleased, and the houses of merchants who had fled were being looted. The agent of the Grand Duke of Tuscany wrote that 5,000 people had died in the last week of July alone, and he himself was ready to flee at a moment's notice, his boots always on and his mind in turmoil. In late July, the king had ordered the students and dons of Oxford to vacate their rooms to make way for the parliamentarians, who were assembling for a new session. The plague followed them, and Charles's hopes of clearing the air after the last meeting in London were dashed. On August 4th, he gave a short opening address to both houses in the grand setting of Christ Church College, urging them to support his policies and pay for the consequences of their vote to break with Spain. The MPs, however, were more focused on their own grievances. They investigated what had happened to the money already voted through and criticized the king's administration, particularly the Duke of Buckingham. George tried to defend himself, but was not allowed to enter the Commons' chamber uninvited. So on August 5th, his loyal friend Sir George Goring introduced a motion asking the Duke to attend the House and address their concerns. On August 9th, George appeared before the rest of parliamentarians and delivered a response to their criticisms. He reminded them of the past achievements and the current challenges, but his charm did not have the same effect this time. The following day, Charles sent a message to the Commons, urging them to act quickly before winter set in, and the plague reached the fleet and army at Plymouth. However, the MP refused to be rushed, promising to vote through the necessary funds when they deemed it convenient. The king's administration continued to struggle. In October, the depleted fleet at Plymouth was dispatched to Cádiz, and John Glanville, a Plymouth MP, was sent as the mission's secretary, possibly in retaliation for his stance in Parliament. George went to The Hague to negotiate with the Dutch and Danish, but the French refused to join the anti-Habsburg League. When George returned home in early December, he was greeted with the news of the fleet's disastrous return. The world seemed to be out of tune in every way, as the ailing John Chamberlain lamented. Charles's English coronation, held on February 2, 1626, was a low-key affair, marred by continued outbreaks of plague and a lack of funds. Henrietta Maria refused to attend, seeing it as a heretical rite. George acted as the king's consort, traveling with him by royal barge up the Thames. They were supposed to land at Sir Robert Cotton's house, but the barge overshot the steps and landed at the back of Westminster Palace. Despite the awkward arrival, Charles and George processed to Westminster Abbey for the main ceremony. A few days later, another parliament opened, and the king's estrangement from his wife was painfully obvious. Henrietta decided to retreat to Denmark House and undertook a pilgrimage to Tyburn, where she knelt at the foot of the gallows to pray for a Jesuit martyr. Charles, growing increasingly frustrated, wrote to George, addressing him as Steenie, and urging him to remove the French entourage from the court. In late July, the king and queen were in London for the betrothal of George's daughter, Mary, to Charles Herbert. The event was a strategic move to entwine the Villiers line with an ancient branch of the Anglo-Welsh nobility. However, tensions escalated when Charles, finding Henrietta in her apartment, ordered her French servants to be rounded up and sent back to France. Henrietta's distress was profound, and she pleaded with Charles, even smashing the windows with her fists in her anger and despair. But Charles was resolute, and the French were driven away like wild beasts. As the wet, miserable summer of 1626 dragged on, the royal household's morale hit rock bottom. The king and queen's relationship was at an all-time low, and the court was rife with tension and uncertainty. The failure of the Cádiz expedition, the spread of the plague, and the growing discontent in Parliament all contributed to a sense of crisis that seemed to have no end in sight. The mood in the country had turned gloomy. John Chamberlain, a well-known letter writer, captured the feeling in one of his letters. "All goes backward," he wrote. "Our wealth, bravery, honor, and reputation are all fading. It's like God no longer blesses our efforts, unlike in Queen Elizabeth's time when everything prospered." Many people blamed George Villiers, the favorite of King Charles I, for the country's problems. Chamberlain described Villiers as a wild horse carrying the king and the country to a disastrous fall. This view was shared by John Eliot, a respected member of Parliament. Eliot and Villiers had once been friends. They first met in 1609, while Villiers was on a tour of Europe with his older brother. In 1618, Villiers nominated Eliot for a knighthood, and made him the acting Vice Admiral of Devon. By the early 1620s, Eliot was seen as both powerful at court and caring about the public. Despite their similar backgrounds, their personalities were very different. Villiers was ambitious and impulsive, while Eliot was cautious and conservative. Eliot believed in following old traditions, rather than exploring new opportunities. Eliot was known for being serious and sometimes pompous, but he was respected for his strong principles. As a young man, he once attacked a neighbor who had criticized him to his father, but he felt so guilty afterward that the neighbor forgave him, and they became lifelong friends. Eliot had supported Villiers and his policies in Parliament, even refusing an early release from prison because he would only answer to Villiers. When Villiers and Charles returned from Madrid in 1623, Eliot strongly backed their plan for a war against the Habsburgs. He believed a quick and decisive military action was better than a long and painful conflict. However, the war ended in disaster. The fleet returned damaged, and hundreds of sick and starving soldiers were left to suffer. This made Eliot feel deeply betrayed. He began to see Villiers as the one responsible for the country's troubles. In London, the situation was dire. The treasury was empty, and there was no money to pay the soldiers and sailors. Local people had to foot the bill, causing unrest. The only solution was to call a new parliament. Charles and Villiers tried to control the elections by appointing potential troublemakers as sheriffs, who were required to stay in their counties. This only made the opposition more determined. One of the key figures in the opposition was Sir John Eliot. He drew up a list of instructions for his agent in London, who was supposed to gather information and report back daily. Eliot also helped draft a document listing Villiers' wrongdoings, such as his religious policies, attacks on government figures, and rumors of sexual misconduct. The plan was to use this evidence to impeach Villiers, similar to how Francis Bacon had been brought down. However, there was a lack of solid evidence. Rumors about Villiers poisoning King James I were circulating, but they were hard to prove. Despite this, Eliot and his allies were determined to act. On February 6, 1626, Charles opened Parliament, urging the members to focus on the country's needs, but the initial response was cautious. On February 10th, Eliot spoke up, reminding the members of the failures of the last Parliament and the need to address the country's problems. He criticized how the money from the last Parliament had been misused, and how the country had suffered losses. He called for the House to address these issues before considering any other matters. The House was taken aback by Eliot's boldness. Some members, like Christopher Wansford, suggested that it was too early to make such motions, as many members had not yet arrived. The mood became cautious, and the House continued with business as usual. Meanwhile, Villiers seemed unaware of the trouble brewing. He proposed setting up an academy for the children of the nobility and gentry, an idea that was seen as a sign of his insecurity. His attempts to visit the French Queen, Anne of Austria, also ended in embarrassment. His friend, the Earl of Holland, reported that the Queen was suspicious and that a visit would be dangerous. As the tension grew, it was clear that a confrontation was inevitable. The country was on the brink of a major crisis, and the fate of George Villiers hung in the balance. George's troubles began to snowball in early 1626. His greed and desire for grandeur had made him enemies, and his reckless actions were starting to catch up with him. One of the biggest issues was the seizure of the French ship, the St. Pierre. It was loaded with valuable goods, and when George overruled the Court of the Admiralty to keep the ship and its cargo, it caused a huge uproar. This move was seen as a serious mistake, and it didn't take long for his critics to pounce. Sir John Eliot, a member of the House of Commons, saw an opportunity. On March 1, 1626, he boldly demanded that George be summoned as a delinquent to answer for his actions. George didn't respond, which only made things worse. The tension in the House of Commons grew, and on March 11th, a meeting of the King's Council of War ended in a heated exchange. The council members refused to answer questions about how taxes were spent, which was seen as an insult to the House. The mood turned mutinous, and Eliot brought up the St. Pierre issue again, calling it a great grievance and abuse. The debate was intense, and though Eliot's motion to hold George accountable was narrowly defeated, it was clear that the tide was turning against the Duke. The next day, a new voice joined the fray. Dr. Samuel Turner, a physician who had treated King Charles's mother, stood up and spoke. He was relatively new to Parliament, and his speech would have a significant impact. Turner argued that the root of the country's problems was a single person, the Duke of Buckingham. He listed 6 areas where George had failed, including his handling of the St. Pierre, his wasteful spending, his control over government positions, his promotion of Catholicism, and his military failures. Turner's speech was a turning point. George's friends, like Sir Edward Conway, were furious and called Turner names, but the damage was done. George realized that there was a more significant force behind the attacks. Sir James Bagge, a corrupt MP from Cornwall, wrote to George, revealing that the Earl of Pembroke, a powerful figure at court, was behind the campaign against him. Bagge claimed that Pembroke had orchestrated the election of several MP who were willing to act against George. George's response was to try to win over his enemies. He had the king promote the Earl of Pembroke to a higher position, hoping to placate him. But the situation with Turner was more difficult. On March 15th, the king sent a letter to the House of Commons, denouncing Turner's seditious words and demanding that he face justice. Turner defended himself, saying he had spoken out of loyalty and for the good of the country. He argued that common fame had been used before to bring down powerful figures, and that he was only reporting what people were saying. Charles, feeling the pressure, summoned both houses of Parliament to the banqueting house. He thanked the Lords but criticized the Commons for their unparliamentary proceedings. The next day, George himself addressed the MP, trying to calm the situation. He explained the military costs and the importance of unity, but the Commons wasn't easily swayed. They began working on a formal remonstrance, a list of grievances against the Duke, and discussed a supply bill to try to keep Charles from dissolving the House. As the debate over common fame continued, the MPs struggled with the idea of using public opinion as a basis for impeachment. They appointed a committee to consider the matter, and after much discussion, they voted to accept it, though with reservations. The debate was intense, and the MP broke for the weekend, unsure of what the future held. Meanwhile, in Antwerp, the famous painter Peter Paul Rubens was working on a portrait of George. He took a break from his work and visited a local bookshop, where he found a pamphlet that caught his attention. It was titled The Forerunner of Revenge, and claimed that George had been involved in the poisoning of King James and other nobles. The pamphlet was written by George Eglisham, a physician who had served King James. Rubens bought a copy, curious about the man he was painting. The allegations were serious, and the pamphlet was just one more piece of the growing storm that was threatening to engulf the Duke of Buckingham. Eglisham's life was a whirlwind of intrigue and controversy, filled with dramatic twists and turns. He was a man of many talents, known for his poetry, astrological medicine, and theology. But his colorful personality and questionable reputation often overshadowed his achievements. Born into a family with noble connections, Eglisham grew up alongside James Hamilton, the son of a marquis, and was even presented to King James I in their youth. This early connection to the royal court would shape much of Eglisham's future, though not always in positive ways. In the early 1600s, Eglisham's path diverged from Hamilton's. While Hamilton followed the king to England, Eglisham ventured to the continent, where he studied at the Scots College in Louvain, a place known for training Catholic spies and insurgents. By 1604, he was back in Britain, working as a tutor to the children of a former magistrate and his Catholic wife. Despite his royal connections, Eglisham struggled to establish a successful medical practice in London. He failed to obtain a license from the College of Physicians, likely due to suspicions about his religious beliefs. This forced him into various dubious business ventures, including an attempt to corner the market on gold leaf, which eventually landed him in financial trouble and legal scrutiny. Eglisham's personal life was as tumultuous as his professional one. He married Elizabeth Downes in the Clink, a prison in Southwark, where a Catholic priest, who was himself imprisoned, officiated the ceremony. They had a daughter and moved into Bacon House, a place with a rich history connected to Sir Nicholas Bacon, a prominent figure during the reign of Elizabeth I. However, by the mid-1620s, Eglisham was in deep financial distress, facing lawsuits from creditors and accusations of counterfeiting coins with a notorious criminal named Edward Yates. Eglisham's life took a dramatic turn in the spring of 1625, when he was called to the bedside of his dying childhood friend, James, Marquis of Hamilton. Hamilton was in a terrible state, suffering from a violent fever and constant vomiting. Despite Eglisham's efforts, Hamilton's condition worsened, and he died 2 days later. The transformation of Hamilton's body after death was horrific, with his face and body swelling to grotesque proportions, and blisters appearing in various colors. The servants and other witnesses were convinced that Hamilton had been poisoned, and Eglisham shared their suspicions, believing the Duke of Buckingham was responsible. The motive for the alleged murder was rooted in a series of events that began in 1622. The Duke of Buckingham, George Villiers, had arranged a marriage between Hamilton's son, also named James, and his own niece Mary, who was just 10 years old. Hamilton, a proud and influential man, was repulsed by the idea of his son marrying into the Villiers family, which he considered common. When the marriage was forced upon them, Hamilton took steps to protect his son, including sending him abroad. However, George thwarted these efforts by arranging for the young Hamilton to be appointed to the royal court, trapping him there. As Mary approached the age of consent, efforts were made to force the consummation of the marriage. Hamilton went to George to demand access to his son, leading to a heated altercation. George, known for his vindictive nature, was enraged by Hamilton's accusations and actions. Shortly after, Hamilton began to take precautions, having his servants taste any food or drink received from George's network. Despite these precautions, 2 of Hamilton's servants fell ill and died, followed by Hamilton himself just 2 days later. Eglisham, who treated Hamilton, believed the symptoms and the rapid deterioration of his condition were clear evidence of poisoning. Eglisham's accusations gained even more weight when he alleged that George had also been involved in the death of King James I. According to Eglisham, on the Monday before the king's death, George gave James a white powder mixed with wine, causing the king's condition to worsen dramatically. George's mother, Mary, then applied a plaster to the king's heart, which further aggravated his condition. When the physicians returned and noticed an offensive smell from the plaster, they suspected poisoning. George, in a fit of rage, expelled the physicians from the room, had one imprisoned, and quarreled with the king's servants, even threatening to draw his sword in the king's presence. Eglisham's account, which was published in a pamphlet, was widely circulated in London, creating a storm of controversy. The House of Commons, already engaged in a battle against George, began to investigate these allegations in secret. On April 24, 1626, John Glanville, the chair of the committee, proposed that further deliberations be conducted in private to avoid hindering the committee's work. Despite objections, the committee met in the Court of Wards, a small room below the Commons chamber, with several MP in attendance as spectators. The doctors who had treated King James, previously silent for fear of implicating themselves, were now being questioned. The committee heard alarming testimonies and incriminating evidence, including the charge that George had forced the physicians to sign a statement declaring the powder he gave the king was a safe and effective medicine. The atmosphere was tense, and the gravity of the accusations hung heavy in the air. As the investigation continued, the shadow of suspicion loomed over the Duke of Buckingham. The once favored courtier, now seen by many as a dangerous and vindictive man, faced the possibility of losing everything he had gained. The story of Eglisham, Hamilton, and the death of King James was a cautionary tale of the dangers of ambition, the price of pride, and the devastating consequences of unchecked power. In the end, Eglisham's life and his accusations would forever be intertwined with the tumultuous and tragic events of the early 17th century, leaving a legacy of mystery and intrigue that would be whispered about for generations to come.